Welcome to the TEFL Commute. This is Season 2, Episode 3, Life Sentence, in which Lindsay and I are joined by Scott Thornbury to discuss model sentences that appear in course books. We'll also see a return of the game timeline, and an episode wouldn't be complete without some more Facebook philosophy. Cue the intro music and let's go.
Hi everybody, and welcome back to the TEFL Commute. My name is Lindsay Clanfield.
And I'm Sean Weldon. Welcome back, everyone.
Yes, and this is a podcast for language teachers that's not about language teaching, but the subject will surely come up.
And I think it's surely going to come up in this episode, Lindsay. They're
I
not going to avoid it.
It's a language teaching episode, because this episode is going to be all about sentences. And we're going to start with actually a test for the listeners, okay? So if you're listening to this on your commute to work, here's a little test for you. I'm going to name four grammatical structures. I'm going to pause for a couple of seconds each time, and I want you to think of a sentence that would illustrate this structure, okay? So get ready, listeners. Here it comes. Structure 1, second conditional. Structure 2, past continuous and past simple. Structure 3, going to for future predictions with present evidence. Okay, that's going to for future predictions with present evidence. And structure 4 is present perfect for experiences. So, I'll go through them again. I want you to think of a sentence that would illustrate each of these. The first one was the second conditional. The second was the past continuous and past simple. The third was going to for future predictions with present evidence. And the fourth was present perfect for experiences. Now, I made you do this quickly because I wanted the first thing that came into your mind. And I want you to compare with what Sean and I came up with as our sentences, and how many of them were the same. So for the second conditional, we had, Sean, what did we have?
If you had $1 million.
What would you spend it on? Something to do with that. So if you had anything like that, dollars, pounds, yen, euros, a lottery. Past continuous and past simple, Sean?
Oh, that's got to be having a bath when the phone rang. So she was having a bath when the phone rang.
And going to for future predictions with present evidence?
Look,
Sean?
Black clouds. It's going to rain.
Okay, and present perfect for experiences?
Well, that will be, have you ever eaten in some kind of restaurant? Probably Chinese.
Yes.
Have you ever eaten Chinese food?
Yes, or another exotic food. As Chinese started becoming more and more common, I think started moving to other exotic foods. So, there you have it. See if you tied in with us. And we're going to actually now bring someone else into our conversation. Can everyone, welcome to Scott Thornbury. Scott, hi.
Hi, Lindsay. Hi, Sean.
I started imagining I had like a live audience there that was going to clap. Well, Scott, thanks very much for joining us. Scott
Pleasure.
is a teacher trainer and writer of several books for teachers, methodology books, including several on grammar. Actually, can you give us a quick rundown of some of the grammar books you've written, just for our audience, in case they don't know?
It's only a 20-minute podcast, Lindsay.
Yes, I've written 5 books with the word grammar in the title. I'm sort of slightly ashamed to say, including How to Teach Grammar, About Language, which is Grammar Tasks, which I'm doing a second edition of, and one called Natural Grammar, and a couple of others in there. One just called Grammar.
Right. So you're the perfect person to have on this podcast, where we're going to be talking about grammar and sentences. The little thing that I did with the learners there, with the listeners. Do you have any others? I mean, would you consider those also the prototypical ones, Scott? Or can you suggest other ones, like for present continuous or anything else?
Well, I mean, present continuous is an interesting example because I remember the days when I first started teaching, it was very difficult to think of of an example that was plausible of the present continuous when you're talking about something happening at the moment of speaking. So you were kind of reduced to situations like, commenting or commentating on news. So, for example, the Queen is just stepping out of her car now, that kind of thing.
Right,
but of course, now with mobile phones, I mean, it's changed completely. I mean, people are constantly running commentary on what they're doing. I'm just popping into Tesco's.
Yes.
So, I mean, that's kind of solved that problem in a sense, because I think one of the problems about these sentences is whether they are, as I say, plausible or credible. Would anybody actually ever say them? It's interesting. The second conditional, the past continuous one about the shower.
Yeah.
She was having a bath when the phone rang. I just did a quick search on a 2 billion word corpus to see whether when the phone rang ever collocates with bath. It never does. There's no single example.
Has it never happened?
It's never happened, obviously, in the whole history of humanity. But it does happen with a shower 3 times. But it's interesting. It's not the past continuous. It's he had been in the shower when the phone rang. He was in the shower when the phone rang. Or Sarah had just gotten out of the shower when the phone rang. But it's interesting that these kind of what we think of as being very representative examples are not that representative when it comes to actual raw data.
That particular example, though, is probably one of the most famous sentences in course books, isn't it? I mean, any teacher will come forward with that example.
Absolutely, but I mean, there's a good reason for this. I think. I mean, it's easy to laugh at them, but they are. Anybody who has written grammar books or written or designed lessons teaching specific items of grammar knows that you need models which are representative in the sense that they're kind of prototypical and situations which everybody in the class can identify with, and that they're intelligible, that they have language in them, that there's no vocabulary in them that's beyond the student's present level. So that's why I think, look at black clouds, it's going to rain is a good example. It's prototypical and it's intelligible.
Right, so a little bit like you take the prototypical meaning of something, even though maybe other meanings or other instances would be more common. I think I heard about this, like for words, you could do it as well. So if hand, we think of the thing at the end of your arm with 5 fingers on it, but actually there would maybe be more common things of like, give me a hand, do you need a hand, and things like that, but we would teach first.
Exactly, and I think this is where dictionaries have to make these kind of same decisions too. What examples do they choose the most frequent, or do they choose the most prototypical as their first example? And it's the same for grammar examples, I think.
Here's a question that I had when I was thinking of these sentences, and I've done this with several teachers. I'd be interested from our listeners if they leave a comment on Facebook or on the blog if they chose the exact or close to same sentences as we did at the top of the episode. But it makes me wonder: is there like a universal box, like Chomsky's black box, but a universal grammar box of sentences that is in everyone's brain, or in English speakers, or sort of generally like humans? Or
I think
the same material too often.
Well, I think this comes back to the thing of prototypes. Henry Wooderson's argued this. The argument between what's sort of genuine and what's authentic. An authentic sentence for most speakers of English, if you said, give me an authentic, it would be something like, John kissed Mary. In other words, subject, verb, object.
Right.
Not Mary was kissed by John, for example. So, and he would argue, Woodison argues, this is the prototype, and you can't get away from that, even though that's maybe not the most common, or even a very politically correct example. But this is where we're at. I think this is the tension between authenticity on the one hand and prototypicality. So when you talk about a universal box of sentences, I say, yes, in our heads we carry around, in a sense, a universal box of prototypical sentences.
Right. Sean.
We need to get away from
I was thinking of what if I had prototypical sentences in my head, I was thinking about a different language that I speak to wonder if they're there. It's interesting, but it's this balance of, I mean, we do drive for authenticity in other areas, yet we have the most inauthentic sentences when we start. It's quite a mismatch, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is that, when you talk about other languages, I mean, of course, the one that comes to my mind in French is La plume de maton est sous la table.
Yes.
And there are these kind of historically famous sentences. Like, you ask any Spanish learner what the prototypical English sentence is, and it would be, my tailor is rich, although it's been about 50 years since that appeared in a course book.
Okay.
Now, I don't know where these things came from, but if you go even further back, of course, you go back into the classics, into Latin and Greek textbooks, you find the most bizarre sentences. There's no sense that authenticity even mattered, because after all, you're dealing with a dead language, so to hell with it. So you get, that the much cited sentence from a Latin grammar. Henry Sweet cited this years ago. The philosopher pulled the lower jaw of the hen, and
what does that mean? I mean, was he doing it on purpose, or was this a thing?
well, I mean, I think this is slightly apocryphal. I'm not even sure that this sentence exists. Henry Sweet wanted to make the point that we need to be more authentic, and this is way back in the turn of the previous last century.
Okay.
But I mean, as Guy Cook pointed out in a paper when he looked at some of these sentences, he said the ironical thing is, although Henry Sweet mocked that sentence mercilessly, everybody now knows it and can remember it. I mean, and it's very bizarreness that makes it memorable. So maybe this is one of the problems with She Was Having a Bath When the Phone Rang, is that it's kind of representative, but it's not going to stick in the studio. It's not going to sort of stand out or be memorable. And so, again, this is another tension in terms of memorability. I mean, I've tried to get around this in various ways. One is to use song titles, for example. So, She's Leaving Home.
Yes.
It's a good representative sentence for the present continuous. And in fact, I used a number of these Beatles titles in a book that I wrote a few years back, and the publishers just at the last jump suddenly got cold feet and thought, oh my God, we better check who owns these song titles of the Beatles. And of course it was Michael Jackson
or something like that, or Michael Jackson. That's right.
And they said there's no way we can use them, so they had to go in the bin, and I had to come up with. But I mean, I do nevertheless still have. It's great now because of Google and everything, and you can, or iTunes, you just go into there and look for song titles. I have lists and lists and lists of song titles. Which, for example, here's a few which are all questions. Are you lonesome tonight? Why does my heart feel so bad? What happened to you? Here's one for you, Lindsay. When will I be famous? Why did we do it? But these are fantastic. So I use these on training courses and that, where I'm out of the, below the parapet, as it were, so I can't get hit for permissions. But because people know the songs, they kind of remember, and this goes to, learners know a lot of these songs too. They've heard them, and so these are great sources for example sentences.
I'd imagine then perhaps you could also imagine that like catchphrases from films,
Exactly.
maybe not film titles so much, but certainly like "I'll be back." I'm sure would make
Make my day. Yeah,
make my day. I'll be back. I'm sure there are other ones, and I wonder if you're not also. I mean, I'm hearing my son using kind of prototypical sentences coming from memes. So but they kind of play around with the grammar a bit. But there's there's one going around right now. Have either of you heard this one? What do you mean? Have you heard that one?
No.
There's a song, or there's a YouTube-y kind of thing. That's because you don't have 11 to 14-year-olds constantly on the computer watching millions of YouTube videos. But what do you mean? They're all saying it, and his friends are saying it at school. And this is something kind of like going around.
Exactly. There's a great one going around Facebook at the moment. It's a picture of Tom Waits and Jeremy Irons. Have you seen that?
Yes.
Tom Waits while Jeremy Irons. And thought, wow, that's fantastic. Present simple third person S. You'll never forget that.
That's Tom Waits while Jeremy Irons. I'm sure that also sounds like a kind of thing that would have appeared in a 1970s course book, but with invented names before they were even famous. Oh, that's a fantastic one.
It looks like the choir's ready. So here's some Facebook philosophy.
Teachers who inspire know that teaching is like cultivating a garden. Those who would have nothing to do with thorns must never attempt to gather flowers. Author unknown.
So we're going to get away from these sort of prototypical sentences then, because if you've got like this online corpus of iTunes of memes on Facebook and even using Google search, is that going to kind of change the sentences that we use, or are we always going to default back?
It's changed them in dictionaries. Now dictionaries, most learners' dictionaries use authentic corpus-based citations, but you do have to. I mean, I'm working on the second edition, as I said, of About Language now, and I'm replacing a lot of the examples with stuff. I've got access to a corpus, and it's a hard work because again, you've got to find something which is short, not too broken up, and it's intelligible, doesn't have vocabulary in it. But at the same time, you do find some wonderful things. And I'm thinking, because you never know quite what the context is. This is one I found this morning. Am I my dad's son still? Or am I his daughter? Am I her wife? Am I her husband?
Is this from a modern thing, or how old is this?
Yeah, this is super modern. But I mean, you'd have to kind of bury in to find out what the full context is. But I mean, it's very simple language. Anything that a student could understand, but it's completely bizarre.
I think I remember a conversation like this with Ken Wilson, who said he came across a dialogue of these wonderful sentences where, again, you'd have to dig into the context, but there were things like, "Is this a leg? I think I've got a hand. Is that an arm?" And the context turned out to be two people doing a jigsaw puzzle. But looking at it in that context, at this marvelous sort of these marvelous questions.
Well, exactly, because I get a lot of cheap laughs out of citing examples from old course books and challenging the audience to think of a context in which these sentences would be used.
Go on, give us a couple then.
Oh, well, okay, if you insist. This is a one from it. Actually, I mean, to be fair, it was printed, I'm just looking at the date here, 1876, but it's the kind of juxtaposition of the sentences which is so bizarre, including as well. So here's a sequence from an exercise, a translation exercise. Have we had the mattresses of the foreigners? We have not had them. Has the Englishman had my good work? He has had it. Has your aunt had my fine pencil? She has had it. Has she had my gold candlestick? And so as it goes on. And then there's one more recent one which I get a lot of laughs up from, which is a bit more like what you're describing of Ken's one but again, difficult to think of a context. This is my head. My brain is in my head. On this on this side of your head is an ear, and on this side of your face is an eye. It's a bit like maybe a cubist painter describing.
Yes, Picasso thing. Yes.
A toe of your right foot is on the seat. Your neck is bent. Now, I mean, I challenge you. I spoke to doctor. Yes, I'm sorry, I have to tell you this, but your X-rays show that your neck is bent.
I'm laughing, but I'm also thinking about how many times we really have done those not necessarily those sentences, but making students kind of point and go, "Oh yes, my head," and I'm almost cringing.
Exactly, but I mean, there was generations of language teachers and course books writers who took this for granted. There was no question that this was kind of like inappropriate, because after all, you could argue that language classrooms have their own, if you like, register or discourse or genre or whatever. So this is perfectly permissible because this is language on display, not language for real use. But
that's true, and that's probably why every language in every language classroom probably has used at one point that like the pen is on the table, because I think le stylo es sur la table or whatever. I did it in Spanish. I remember when I was learning Spanish, and that sounds like such a boring, inauthentic sentence, but I suppose the teacher's struggling for a sentence to illustrate a preposition and has a pen in his hand,
exactly,
and is standing right in front of a student and just slams it on the table and says, "On." The pen is on the table.
Absolutely, and there's nothing more pedagogically real than that, even though it's not necessarily a sentence that. But yeah, no, it's interesting, and one of my favorite bits of in response to this, or satires of this, was James Joyce, who actually taught English for a number of years as a struggling writer. He taught for the Berlitz School in Trieste, among others. And he wrote this he was so frustrated by this ridiculous language that he wrote a rant to Berlitz himself, saying, Berlitz, what have I done to deserve this from you? Senor Berlitz and Senor Joyce, fool and beggar, what is a pachyderm? See that man there with a trumpet for a nose and that sizable belly? There's a pachyderm, etc. You wonder, in fact, whether this bizarre, almost surreal use of language that you get on these old course books might have in fact fed into his later writing, like Finnegan's Wake. There's a thesis for you.
Yeah. Oh, that would be an interesting question. But coming to a larger issue, I mean, we're gonna have to be wrapping this up. Unfortunately, I think we could go on for quite a long time on these sentences. But one of the larger questions I want to sort of wrap this more or less up with is the sentence. I mean, you were citing examples from the late 1800s, from up till now, the modern course books, technology, things like Duolingo and everything. The sentence still seems to hold sway over grammar. What's about that? Is it just the thing that makes the most sense? Or
well, I think for a long time we've been trapped in, if you like, what you might call the tyranny of the sentence. The idea that grammar or language even is sort of its archetypal quintessential forms is well crafted sentences that begin with a capital N and finish with a full stop, because we know that in spoken language such things don't exist. And also that sentences on their own seldom manage to capture enough meaning. I mean, it's very difficult, and I'm finding this at the moment. I'm looking for sentences which embody the use of the definite and indefinite article, but you've really got to go across sentences before you can see why a definite article has been chosen. So sentences in their own, and they're kind of useful for teaching purposes, but if we think of them as the kind of limits of grammar, then we're seriously... it's a kind of tunnel vision view of language. I think we do need to go, dare I say it, beyond the sentence, but we'll never quite escape sentences. And sentences, of course, are the basis of a lot of linguistic theories of language. Think of Chomsky's transformational generative grammar. I mean, he was only interested in well-formed sentences, and it produced well-formed sentences which were completely meaningless. The most famous sentence in all linguistics is colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Simply to make the point that grammaticality, if you like, being well-formed, does not rely on meaning. It's all about getting the right words in the right order. But I think, other theories of language and more functional ones and more discourse-based theories, we've moved and should be moving away from this dependence on just individual sentences.
Now it's time to welcome back our podcast game, Timeline. Welcome to Timeline, the TEFL Commute's on-the-move game for teachers. Okay, in order to play Timeline, you need to draw yourself a mental timeline. We've all used timelines in the classroom. Get the pen, draw a line. Over here on the left is usually the past. Moving towards the right is the future, with somewhere with a little cross or an intersection for now in the middle. So draw yourself that mental timeline now. Great, so now you're ready to play. Timeline at the ready. We're about to give you a number of items which you have to place on the timeline in the correct order. The items will come to you in a random order, and you have to order them from the one furthest in the past to the one closest to now. Once we go over the answers, everything you get into the correct order earns you 1 point. Get a full house of points and you can win today's prize, which is feeling very smug for yourself. Okay, are you ready to play? Today's topic is grammarians. During our conversations with Scott for this podcast, he mentions a number of grammarians. So that's our topic for today's timeline. We'll give you the name of the grammarian, and you need to put them on the timeline in order of date of birth. During our conversation, Scott gave us the names of 4 people, so these are the people you need to put in the correct order. Number 1, Henry Sweet. Number 2, Noam Chomsky, followed by Maximilian Berlitz, and finally Henry Widdowson. So remember, you're putting them in order of date of birth. So that's Chomsky, Widdowson, Berlitz, and Sweet. Thinking time. how did he do? Did he get them all? Let's find out. So, in the correct order, first up you'll have, born on the 15th of September 1845, Henry Sweet. He'll be followed by Maximilian Berlitz, who was born in April 1852. Next on the timeline there'll be Noam Chomsky, who was born in 1928. And finally, the baby of the bunch is Henry Widdowson, born in 1935. So that's 4 marks if you've got them all in the correct order, and no arguing with our sources, which of course tend to be Wikipedia. Join us again in a future podcast episode for another game of Timeline. So, thanks to Scott for that. There's a lot of food for thought. I'm sure one of those podcasts we'll have to play a few times. Scott, before we go, where can people find you or find things that you mentioned in this podcast? Is there a place they can go?
Yeah, you can go to my website, scottthornbury.com, and I've got a couple of blogs which are at the moment moribund while I catch up with various other projects. But I mean, I've actually talked about sentences on my blog, an A to Z of ELT. S for sentence, I think, is one of the entries. So please visit.
And you said there's a second edition of About Language coming. When can
and that is coming out at the end of next year or the beginning of the following year. And things take their time. And meanwhile, as I say, I'm having a lot of fun trawling through the corpora looking for interesting sentences.
Fabulous. So we'll put the links to those websites on the TEFL Commute one, so people can find them if they want to go and look stuff. The A to Z especially is a useful resource to go to for all things teaching.
And I'm very happy to hear that a new edition of About Language is coming out. This is a book that has accompanied many a Delta trainee on their journey towards better understanding of grammar. So it's really good to hear that that's getting updated, and look forward to seeing and getting our hands on a copy of that. Scott, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Pleasure. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Lindsay.
Okay. That brings us to the end of another episode. Thanks, everyone, for listening, and enjoy the rest of your commute.
As your commute is coming to an end, here's an activity you can take into class. Write the following sentence stems on the board. 1 of us can, 2 of us can, 3 of us can, none of us can. Elicit ways of completing the pattern from the students. Then divide them into groups of 4 and give them a time limit. They have to generate as many true sentences as they can about their group using these stems. Ask the groups to share some of the more interesting sentences they've created. This activity can be adapted to many structures. Instead of can, use has, have got, or is, are going to, or used to. We found this activity in Scott Thornbury's book, simply titled Grammar, published by Oxford University Press in 2005. You can read more about this and find links and ideas for this episode to use in class at our website, www.teflcommute.com. You've been listening to the TEFL Commute, an original podcast produced and presented by Lindsay Clanfield, Sean Wilden and James Taylor. Don't miss out on any episodes by subscribing to us on iTunes or YouTube, and by visiting us at www.teflcommute.com.